Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ed3 podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome today someone who's a transformational coach, a wrangler, a shepherdess, and a change agent. She's a glitter bomb of positivity and change. Like when she explodes, it gets everywhere and it spreads everywhere. It is so wonderful. She leads change for creatives and entrepreneurs. She also specializes in education, bringing those skills to this new world of learning. She not only talks about it, which I really appreciate, she also walks the walk with her own children. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. And what I love most about this Halifaxian Rocky is that she is excited to connect and help others connect. So seriously, the status quo is the only one that can say it's the hope that kills you. So please welcome the greatest hope since Obama, Hope Paterson. Welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
I think that's my favorite intro I've ever had.
That's my goal. I got to have the best intro ever. I think it's deserved because you're doing so much amazing work. And I loved one line that I, read on your website about daring pivots. And so I wanted to just start there and ask you, what are the daring pivots that you think education needs to make as an industry?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, as somebody who has been living into daring pivot since I was about 6 years old, I think I discovered that you could do a daring pivot and go a different path than everybody else. That struck me as I struck gold when I realized that. I feel like daring pivots for education require people to feel courageous to think differently. I think it's very easy for educators or schools, education paradigms to do things the way they always have because they always have. And, it's leave it and set it or just get comfortable and just keep going. And it's too much trouble to renovate the house and to pivot and to do all this change, especially when the world outside is changing so much. But I would say it's such an honor to work with people as I do who are courageous and willing to make pivots and think differently, whether that's the way they run their approach to teaching and learning or the kinds of information that they see as applicable for the people who they are teaching or who are learning in their space. Yeah. To be able to think differently is a skill that I think our learners or our future generations are going to need.
Yeah, and it's almost
Yeah.
modeling that behavior, right? As a lot of people who listen to this are educators or administrators who are willing to make daring pivots, but those are hard to do. So I'm curious because you work with people who are trying to make daring pivots. So what are the big lessons? Like if someone's listening to this and they want to integrate some of these big ideas, what's the thing that usually blocks them or maybe prevents them from getting all the way there? Whether, you've learned from education, but also in other industries too.
Yeah. Yeah, I did actually start as working as a coach and entrepreneur in all different sectors. And when I landed in education, because I was inspired for my own children, thinking about what impact we could make for the future and all this stuff bubbling and fizzing in education, I started to see the opportunity for people to come back to themselves. And in education, when we're able to come back to our own compass and values, not what we're being told by the government necessarily or by external forces all the time. When I see educators, teachers, or people who are building education movements or platforms come back to values that really resonate for them, like their why, that is a really great place to start. And it's not rocket science, but it does require reflection. And so that's really some of the work that I do at the beginning is to go through that with them, sort of to be their co-pilot and to help that reflection time yield some simple results, which are what's important to me, what's the essence of what I'm trying to do. And when they see that and feel it, the work that comes out of that allows them to pivot or shift their work in directions that really feel honors them and what they're out here to do.
Yeah. I'm curious how you and your husband have had a great chance to meet as well. How did you think about those questions when you thought about your own parenting and especially in regards to education? Because you can tell us a little bit about some of the changes or
Yeah.
choices you've made and sort of how does that tie into your why or what you valued and why you made some of the decisions you
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky that I married a fellow pivoter, somebody really game to bust out of the usual patterns. And when we had kids, we had done a tremendous amount of travel as young adults and, in our early 20s and 30s. And then when we had kids, there was a moment in which we found ourselves sort of slotted into that. Okay, now we have to be grown ups and we settle down and you get a good job and you buy a house and we did those things. And we would find ourselves staying up late at night, looking at each other, being like, is this all there is? Is this what it is to be a grown up? Like, we can't adventure anymore. We can't pivot. We can't sort of embody what's really important to us. And so we had to build up enough courage and enough late night conversations to the point where Charlie and I said, okay, we're going to do it. And we called it our trust fund, our fund of trust. We don't have a trust fund. And we basically put it all into spending a year with our families on the road. And that courageous leap allowed us to expand our network and travel around the world with the kids and really spend time together as a family. For us, wealth was really about time and showing our kids that learning happens everywhere and learning happens in all moments of their lives, and that there is a whole huge world other than the pattern. Because I think as a parent, I'm sure you know this, it matters less what we say, but more what we do. So Charlie and I were like, okay, let's keep doing this. We'll find ways. We'll be, scrappy to find ways to build up our fund of trust. And I think in doing that, then we became an example for other families to be like, okay, so you did it. How did you do it? What was that crazy leap? And has it impacted your kids? And what have you seen that has come from that? So it's from that 1 year, Scott, we have been living on the dividends of those connections with our kids. We've seen how they have completely flourished as learners and they have a great sense of themselves in this bigger world. And I think the impact to our community has been like, okay, they're not so crazy. They've done it. So maybe I can. And we've watched other people kind of rocket out, do the quadruple bypass of the pattern more and more.
Yeah, you have to deprogram, right? Like before you can do those things. I'm curious, like to get into the specifics. I know you've mentioned that you've noticed people more and more willing to try alternative learning paths of all ages, but especially parents with, kids probably in the K-12 system. So what worked for you on the road and maybe what didn't work? And as you talk to people who are considering alternative learning paths, like what are kind of some of the things you typically are recommending to them?
Well, starting with the what worked, what didn't, I think when we tried to recreate school in, in our own setting of traveling with our kids, it didn't work. As soon as we started to hold it all too tightly, schedule and program and like jam our schedules too full, it didn't work. But as soon as we start to relax and deprogram, as you say, as parents, when we came from traditional schools, our kids saw us relax. They relaxed. And then the learning kind of started to happen organically. So that's always my words of support for families is to not hold your kids' education so tightly, is to get to know them as people, as individuals, and see where their interests lie. Get them to be active participants. What do you want to learn about? Like if you put the onus back onto kids, even when they're little, they really know they start to develop that sense of agency that we all talk about. That's important. We actually go through the modeling exercise of like, okay, so what do you want to learn? And the more we did that, and the more I see other families not holding on to the like college prep track as
Yeah.
tightly and getting to know their kids more and saying, okay, so you want to learn more about architecture or you're interested in welding. Oh, you want to build a dirt bike or it's all learning. And I think when parents start to see their kids' excitement for what learning can look like by diving really deep into one subject, once you know how it goes, like once you've nailed going deep in one area, no matter how old you are, you're like, I get learning, I get it. And then you're more likely to learn all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And I know like it's kind of in a way you were learning what it was like to be a teacher, right? And how you have to sort of feel comfortable with that. I know we were talking before we hit record about kind of the challenge a lot of these teachers face in sort of being in that role and also taking care of themselves and maybe keeping that flame lit of
Yeah.
passion. So I'm curious, you talk to a lot of educators, like what are some of the things that you're seeing out there that are maybe challenges, but also how are you helping people overcome that sort of feeling of maybe being squished a bit by the system?
Squish is a good word. Yeah. Well, I have the honor and privilege to work with a lot of people in education, whether they're teachers or administrators or building schools. And I feel like the pandemic 3 or so years really discombobulated our systems, but really created, I would say, a lot of stress for teachers in so many different ways. And then coming out of that, there is now flows of new technology, AI kind of coming at them fast and furious. The idea of you must close the gap. The children are behind, so you got to close the gap. So I'm getting this sense in my communication and my events that I run with educators is they feel stressed. And yes, they want to keep building these skills so that they can be better teachers. But they, as humans, as individuals, also want to feel well. They want to feel like they are regulated humans.
Mm.
So I guess the topic that I've really put my finger on the pulse of is how can we support teachers to regulate themselves, not just coping by overworking or keeping themselves even busier with more courses, but finding ways to regulate their nervous system so that they are able to co-regulate with the kids in their care. As it's something I've discovered in the last few years, even as parents, we as the grown-ups in kids' lives are the ones that kids regulate to. So when we're dysregulated, when we're discombobulated, the kids are too. So I think that, yes, it's important to build skills, but it's also vital to have ways for them to ground and regulate.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I just spoke to Saba a few weeks ago on the podcast, and we were talking about building a culture, especially that when it talks to adopting technology, you need to have a culture that accepts and embraces change and
Mhm.
enables teachers to try things that might not work. But underneath that, like kind of vague word of culture, there's actually a bunch of individuals, right, that need to be in the right mental state to 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 build that culture. So you've done that across organizations, not just in education. So how do you kind of go about that? If we need a culture of disruption or a culture of innovation or a culture of, problem-based learning, whatever the culture or question we're trying to solve for, how do you talk to an individual or how do you start to make those cultural changes in a school or organization?
I think for me, culture is, I think I often liken it to like a living, breathing. Sometimes I call it like a sourdough culture with like the bubbles fizzing all the time. It's ever present. And I think if we consider culture in education as sometimes like we've written our values out on a Google Doc or a board, and as long as we look at them sometimes or one board meeting a month, then we've got culture covered. I I would prefer to see, and where I work with organizations in education is how do you weave in that cultural fabric on an ongoing basis. And this looks different depending on your organization or your school, but bringing people together and giving people opportunity to voice how they feel in a productive way. And I think also doing things outside of just the learning and the administrative goals, but finding ways for people to feel creative, finding ways to people to feel inspiration, because that sort of seeds this embodied culture that kids will feel or other educators in that culture will feel. So it's how do you nurture those seeds of sort of creativity and inspiration and feeling safe to share? And then once you get that going, keep it going on a regular basis because that will create its own sort of ripple effects that will be felt by the whole learning community, whether it's parents or other educators, and definitely by the kids.
Hmm. And you've kind of been able to do that virtually, which I think is actually a superpower, is making people feel welcomed and encouraging people to explore. I know I felt that just kind of being pulled into the network. You're really great at connecting people and you have a brain trust as well, where you kind of help individuals meet with one another. So I'm curious, you've probably been a lifelong connector, but how did that become a professional pursuit? And what are you trying to do in these, kind of ad hoc or more formal communities that you've been building?
I love people. I absolutely genuinely love people. And I realized that when I started traveling as a teenager and then extended that travel into my 20s and 30s. And I realized the line through was people are endlessly fascinating. And I think my love of connecting is to see the light and the uniqueness in every person I meet. But when I do meet them, something happens in my brain where I start to want to connect them with specific people that I know would be helpful for their mission or their work or their life goals. So probably about 8 years ago, I started to weave in this being a super connector or hopeful glue into my work offering. And so when I landed in education, I started to see this sort of living, breathing network as something I could not just use for my work, but open up to others. And there's plenty of people in education, yourself included, like you get in your silo of like you're working in one section, whether you're in academia or you're in school building or ed tech or AI platform development. And you know everyone there is to know about that subject. But what about bridging those different islands together? So about 8 months ago, I thought, what would it be like if I created something where we brought a whole bunch of brains and personalities together in a very open-minded, sort of collaborative space. And we created events each month where people can connect. So I have been doing that, been talking about all sorts of themes in education and bringing people together, Scott, that are like 17 years old, leading some very established educators through workshops, and then people all the way to 75-year-olds who are in retirement, or as they say, rewirement. And there's something so cool about getting different ages together from all different continents. You start to feel like I'm not alone. And there's other perspectives that can be brought in from other areas or stakeholder groups in education that I think really helps to build, culture on a larger scale. Yeah, it's exciting. And what started as an experiment has evolved into this beautiful sort of group that are collaborating and partnering all over the place, which brings me so much joy.
Yeah. And I think it's so powerful. I remember being at university and going to I don't know, like a Christmas service and realizing that I hadn't seen anyone over 25 besides my professors in months and thinking that was a bit strange. And when you think about learning as, I always say it's an Olympic sport, right? We have to keep doing it. Like that 17-year-old and that 71-year-old might have a lot to learn from each other and to support each other with, which is pretty powerful. So I love that. I'm bringing people together. And I just wonder, like, how does this squishy thing of people and culture that are like non-predictable, which makes it the fun part, right? Like that's why humans are so fun. But then you're trying to overlay like technology and policy and curriculum and these things that are very rote. So how do you kind of think about that? And how do you help teachers, bring these tools into a classroom knowing that the tool is not going to change, but the every class that comes in is probably going to be different and have to somehow change how you show it or use it or teach people how to take advantage of it.
Well, I personally don't bring in the tools into the classroom, but I am definitely the connector of
Mm,
finding people like yourself. I actively hunt for people working to build tools that make them accessible, that make
mm,
them human in that not anthropomorphizing them, but make them really feel like they doesn't matter how old the teachers are, educators are, that they could weave them into their practice. So I'm really more the connecting piece. But what I see when it works is teachers feel like their life or job gets easier as opposed to more complicated and more stressful. So back to that regulation, back to the like looking at humans in the mix is as long as they're feeling supported and like they understand the why, it's feeding back to why am I an educator and how does this help me? I feel like it empowers them as opposed to overwhelms them.
yeah. Yeah, that's a really fun way to think about tech is not a stressor coming for our jobs, but instead, can it help me regulate or be more present in my task.
And
Learn great product.
I would say, Kevin Kelly, futurist, is really an optimist voice
Yeah.
in the mix here. And I am a huge fan of him and people who are being optimistic, because I feel the more if you're going to deliver a workshop to a group of educators and you preface it with that kind of optimism, it opens their mind and it sees what it is for them. As opposed to if you were starting with a pretty functional, technical, walls start to go up. So it's like this beautiful human opening that I see lots of possibility.
Yeah. It's not that 50% of your job's going to be automated, so you better come to my workshop, right? It's
Well,
here and see what's possible.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. Well, I think that's a great place to kind of bring one of the questions I always love to ask people is what you just kind of said. Like, what's the most optimistic thing you're seeing in education? Like, what's exciting you right now? And you get to be on the ground, listening to a lot of people who are working in the space, which I think's, Greg Eisenberg says, the best way to create a product is first to gather a community and then just listen to them. And that sort of feels like what you're doing. So, where's education headed based on the conversations you're listening to? What are you optimistic about?
I am definitely optimistic about the intergenerational learning I'm watching and a part of, watching young digital natives teach older generational teachers who have tremendous wisdom and expertise in their own right, seeing them trade their skill sets openly for other people is a beautiful thing. I think the more we can weave cultures that have that intergenerational learning, I think it helps to ground younger people to see, okay, there is wisdom, there is something useful that is elemental in human story with older people. And then I can also teach, which means I learn. So I love that sort of cross pollination between different ages. That's made more possible through tech. And I also think living in our global world, platforms, just like what we're using now or Zoom, ways to get people together from all different continents to be able to sync up and inspire each other and shine spotlight on each other. It feels less lonely. I think being innovators, as you know, can sometimes feel lonely. And if you feel like you've got a cohort of people in your corner, you're more likely to move through any obstacles.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. Well, tell us, you have the Brain Trust, you have a great newsletter, a podcast episodes. So, like, where's the best place for someone to come learn more and get sucked into this world of optimism and possibility?
Well, definitely my Brain Trust, which I will share the link. And I have my Hope Sparks Substack, which is basically me shining a spotlight on all the amazing work that I'm privy to be a part of, or at least know about. And also a network on Mighty Networks for all educators and parents to explore where the future of education is going.
That's great. Well, we'll put all the links at ed3.gg. So if you see this video anywhere on the internet, come on back there and get all the links that you need to learn more about hope. And any final thoughts or words of advice for our audience before we jump off?
I mean, I think just coming back to the beginning, which is have the courage to think differently. Whether or not you're a parent who knows that your kid isn't thriving in school, or you're an educator, feels in your heart you want to do things differently, but you're not quite sure how, to people starting schools or building platforms, is our world definitely needs more original ways of looking, learning. So yeah, think differently.
Take some daring pivots. We're going to be doing that, and hope we'll be there cheering you on. So we thank you so much for the time, for sharing your optimism and positivity. And it's always fun to connect.